Good morning. It's a good turnout. Thanks for coming. The recent Chinese cyber operations are different. This presentation will investigate why they're different. This was my personal research project, which I've been undertaking for the last couple of years. It's just that it has acquired a whole new significance in light of the recent Volt Typhoon disclosures. This presentation would also help us understand how we can leverage geopolitical and geostrategic analyses when you start hitting the limits of technical analysis. So let's jump straight into it. Mandatory disclaimers first. The views expressed here are purely my personal and have nothing to do with my employer. Another disclaimer. When I use the word China or Chinese, they imply the state and organs of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, set up by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. It has no judgment whatsoever on the fascinating Chinese culture, society, and history. Now, I'm using a method of intelligence analysis where the summary or the conclusion is presented upfront, bottom line upfront, or bluff as we call it. So the grand summary of my presentation really is that the recent Chinese cyber operations have all the hallmarks of a military mobilization. What in military terms is called the operational preparation of the environment. And the idea here is to support future military operations using what has been done now. The grand objective behind this is not that sinister. It is to basically secure the PRC's geo-economic interests in the region, especially its near abroad. And to be really honest, this is what any rising power would do. Now, there are a couple of pillars to my presentation, which I'm going to deconstruct or summarize in the beginning, and then we'll delve into them in detail further on. Now, the strategic shift that we are witnessing from traditional cyber espionage operations is mainly about the use of information warfare to gain airspace and sea dominance in the South China Sea. The control would be gained by attempting to disrupt the United States logistical supply lines, the sea lines of communication, and its naval power projection capabilities in that region. While the cyber targeting is global, I strongly believe that the focus is quite local to the sphere of influence of the PRC, especially limited to the South China Sea. In terms of the architecture of cyber operations, the PRC's civilian and threat actors have been absorbed into a wartime construct called the Information Operations Group, which we'll talk about later. The second part of my bluff is that the reason why we're seeing so many tactical infrastructure overlaps between various threat activity clusters and threat actors is because of the absorption of the civilian cyber infrastructure into the military command control, what's called the Information Operations Group. The civilian authorities are also deemed as what they call authorized forces for that reason. And this is quite unlike what, say, the democratic countries are used to, where there's a clear delineation between the civilian and the military authorities. We'll look into that, what's the precedent there. Now, in terms of the command control, the strategic cyber operations are being authorized by a highly concentrated, highly centralized national command authority called the Central Military Commission, which falls directly under the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. And apart from the grand objective, the key operational or political military objectives here are to use information in cyber operations as a first strike capability before the onset of kinetic or physical warfare. There's a second objective as well, to use information in cyber operations to conduct political or cognitive warfare below the threshold of armed conflict to disrupt the adversary's political system. Now, having said that, let's start deconstructing what I have summarized. The agenda looks roughly like this. We'll talk about Volt Typhoon and Red Echo. We'll look at the elephant in the room, that's the strategic support force of the People's Liberation Army. We'll look into the Communist Party's information warfare command control. We'll look at how the disparate civilian elements are absorbed into a wartime construct using the information warfare construct called military civil fusion. And we'll sum it all up as to what's the bigger story here. And then we'll briefly jump into the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, which is really driving all this. And then we probably have 5 minutes for questions. Now, this is going to be a fast and furious presentation. So pay more attention to what I'm saying. Instead of the slide deck, you can always refer to it later. A little bit about myself. I'm a blue teamer in the day and a geopolitical analyst at night. More than a decade back, when I joined the Indian government, I realized the tremendous potential which cyber operations have in changing the global balance of power. So I became a student of geopolitics and geostrategy on my own. And my background is in malware analysis. I have a computer science engineering degree, but I recently acquired a degree in cyber geopolitics from the Australian Defence Force Academy. I'm based in Australia as well. This was to majorly gain formal recognition in geopolitics and geostrategy. I started doing my own research. And now my geopolitical and geostrategic writings have been published by the US Military Academy, the US Army, the Australian Defence College, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is a prestigious think tank in the Indo-Pacific, and the Indian Army. Now, my analytical methodology carries a unique fusion of geopolitical and geostrategic analyses and malware analysis. Now, given the new disclosures on Volt Typhoon, which are quite sensational, I'm largely going to 80% of my presentation is around geopolitical and geostrategic analysis, because that's the part which is quite difficult to decipher. And I believe the audience here, the kind of audience we have in Black Hat, is well versed with technical analysis, malware analysis, and information is out there, a lot of information in the open source on Volt Typhoon, which you can go through. So I also want to showcase how we can leverage geopolitical and geostrategic analysis when you start hitting the limits of technical analysis. Let's jump straight into Volt Typhoon. So May 2023, there was a simultaneous disclosures by the intelligence agencies of the Five Eyes that there's a threat actor called Volt Typhoon, which was targeting Western critical infrastructure. There was a clear deviation from traditional intelligence operations that are attributed to the Chinese threat actors. And the intent, as was expressed there, was to clearly preposition itself into Western critical infrastructure. The threat actors were known to use primarily living off the land techniques and hands-on keyboard activity to maintain a fair bit of operational security. And back then, when the dispatch came out, we knew that the threat actor was probably active since mid-2021. There was a simultaneous disclosure by other cybersecurity companies like Microsoft as well, so that's where the story started. Then between December 2023 and January 2024, Lumen, a network security analytics company, traced a specific component of Volt Typhoon's command control infrastructure. Now that command control infrastructure was built on end-of-life devices, small home office routers, which were quite easy to compromise. So these devices were then all cobbled together and were used to build a multi-hop anonymity network to provide anonymity to the actual operators who were hiding behind this command control network. Interestingly, there were two broad activity clusters which were using this command control network, this anonymized command control network. They were called the KV cluster and the JDY cluster. Now, the KV cluster, which was using this anonymity network, relied more on hands-on keyboard activity, and they were using this C2 network for targeting high-value assets. But the JDY cluster was a bit more noisy. They were doing more opportunistic scanning and targeting and reconnaissance. So it feels like the KV cluster was quite focused on operation security. And there was a clear overlap between this anonymity network with Volt Typhoon. Now, the key procedure used by Lumen to discover all this was global network telemetry analysis, which tells you maybe what are the challenges behind, say, detecting the traces of this intrusion. As the timeline moved further on, more disclosures happen. And you can see my timeline is pretty crowded now. So I won't go into all this in detail, but what I want to showcase here is that this activity is still ongoing. I kept on updating this slide deck since till last week. So in January 2024, there was the Department of Justice of the US took down the KV botnet, which we talked about earlier. They found a weakness in the command control to take it down. This was done remotely. It's very interesting. There was a second Five Eyes disclosure in February 2024 on the same threat actor, Volt Typhoon, and this time they mentioned, hey, well, we thought this activity was active since mid-2021. No, it's not. It was active since 5 years. Something really interesting going on there. And they also confirmed that the TTPs were hands-on keyboard activities combined with living off the land techniques, but they also mentioned that the threat actor was using extensive pre-compromise reconnaissance to make sure that their operational security is tight. And then there was a Dragos report in February 2024. There were And further on, as I kept on tracking these developments, in March 2024, the US Department of Treasury declared some sanctions against individuals belonging to APT 31. We'll talk about that in a bit. But APT 31 is known to target end-of-life devices since 2019. So interesting. Some of the victimology of the APT 31 group in that indictment quite aligned with Volt Typhoon. So APT 31 was specifically targeting investment critical infrastructure, as was mentioned in this indictment. But interestingly, the US government did not clearly link it to Volt Typhoon. They did not say APT 31 is Volt Typhoon. So what's happening there? We'll look at that. And then between January and April 2024, you're probably tracking this. Ivanti 0 days were exploited, and Volt Typhoon was trying to use these 0 days as well. So a lot of activity happening even till now, till last week. Now let's summarize Volt Typhoon in a bit. So the target geographies which it targeted were continental and the non-continental United States, non-continental bit being Guam and Hawaii. We'll look into that in a bit. Asia-Pacific and Africa. The target sectors were quite startling, really. You know, your electric grids, your wastewater systems, telecommunication systems, satellite networks, and emergency management system. Now, the emergency management systems is an interesting bit. Note that down because we're going to touch upon that later. There were potential tactical and infrastructure overlaps with other threat actor or activity clusters like Cost of Eat, APT 31, which we talked about earlier, Mirai botnet for some reason, and another activity cluster which was linked to Ivanti zero-day exploitation. If you look at the TTPs in isolation, they are unremarkable. We've known them for years, but when these TTPs executed in unison, the whole kill chain becomes really effective. The signal-to-noise ratio is very high, so they're difficult to pin down. And I mentioned they have active since 5 years. I'll go back to the previous slide. I also want to mention one more interesting tidbit. So the US actually had to invoke unprecedented powers under the Federal Intelligence Surveillance Code, the FISA code, to start tracing this botnet into the domestic homeland. Because that order basically allows them to tap into local networks for which they need a special permission. That permission they need to get the permission every month. So it seems like the traditional detection approaches at scale were not working, and so they had to go to the court to do some enhanced monitoring of the domestic network to discover what the targets were. Very interesting. Now let's segue into some bit of geostrategy. What is Guam? We talked about Guam. Guam is a US military outpost, and it is you see that red circle there? It is the closest outpost, military outpost of the US next to Southeast Asia. It is bang next to what they call the 9-dash line, which is a highly contested area in the South China Sea, which China claims to be its own, yet other countries also claim it. So there's a lot of contestation going on in that contested area. And in the last couple of years, there has been a massive military buildup in Guam. A lot of air and naval assets have been deployed there by the US, which has caused a lot of tension between the PRC and the US. So it's a bit of a flashpoint, and for obvious reasons. Now let's look at the second military activity, cyber military activity cluster, which targeted India. So between 2020 and 2022, there was a tense standoff between the two nuclear armed neighbors, India and China. And they have a controversial contested Indo-China border. As the tensions escalated, Recorded Future, using the same network telemetry analysis, discovered that some threat actors, Chinese threat actors, had compromised Indian critical infrastructure, electric grids, closer to the flashpoint of the border. And Recorded Future also mentioned that the intention wasn't, these targets had little intelligence value, and so the intent clearly was to preposition in case the conflict escalates. So it was quite a flashpoint that was happening, which got de-escalated in 2022. So let's summarize these activity clusters which targeted India. There was infrastructure overlap with APT 41, Tonto team. We'll look into all these threat actors later. There was tactical overlap with APT 31, the usual suspect here. We'll look into that. The targeting was quite closely aligned with Volt Typhoon. Apart from the electricity grid, thermal power plants, seaports, and whatnot, the emergency management system, we had seen that in Volt Typhoon as well, was also compromised. We'll look into that. Why? And now there was also some tactical similarities with Volt Typhoon. First of all, the use of multi-hop anonymity network, use of edge IoT devices like IP cameras to build that C2 network, and the use of fast reverse proxy. Now, fast reverse proxy is a nifty little tool to create a reverse proxy connection from a compromised network to your control network, to your attacker's control network. It can use covert channels. And while this is not a major overlap, but fast reverse proxy was quite explicitly mentioned in the Volt Typhoon disclosures which were made by the US government. So there was that kind of a little bit of tooling overlap there, which is really interesting. So I would say with moderate confidence that the strategic genesis or the intent of these two operations were quite similar. That is Volt Typhoon and the Red Echo cluster. Now, what really is happening here? Let's talk about the elephant in the room, the strategic support force. The strategic support force is a joint integrated strategic information warfare command of the People's Liberation Army. Think of it as like the US Cyber Command, except that it's much superior in its mandate as compared to the US Cyber Command. The SSF was created in 2015 as a part of the larger reorganization of the PLA that was going on since the last 30 years. It's called the Revolution in Military Affairs. It was also created under the shadow of the Obama-Xi talks, happened in 2014. The US government wanted China to curtail its cyber espionage activity, which really hammered the US economy back then. And so the Chinese establishment felt that they need to probably exercise more operation security for their military operations, military cyber operations, so it needed a little bit of restructuring there. Also, the Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive also influenced this reorganization. So there are two departments in the SSF. We'll talk about the network system department, which absorbed the signals intelligence, the network warfare, the electronic warfare, and the political warfare outputs from 3 PLA and the 4 PLA, its predecessors. These diagrams which I've created are my custom-made. They are high-resolution links available for download later on. And you don't have to pay too much attention to them. We can look into them later. Just focus on my story, and you'll get to understand what I'm talking about. There's a lot of bits and pieces to the diagrams. And I researched multiple sources to create them, so there's a lot of sort of effort made around these diagrams to make sure they're accurate. Let's look at another component of the reorganization, the theater commands. Now, the PLA also reorganized how it fights integrated warfare across its near abroad, its land and sea borders. These are called the geographic theaters of operation, and they wanted to introduce more joint warfare strategies into it. Earlier, they had entities called the military regions, which were pretty much like the theater commands, except that they did not have joint warfare capabilities, integrated capabilities. So now we have north, west, south, east, west theater commands, and central theater command. Example being, let's just take an example, Western Theater Command, which is, of course, focused to the PRC's west. That's India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So it's more focused on the near abroad. And keep in mind that the theater commands have some role to play in the strategic information warfare capabilities, so we'll look into that later. Now let's look at how, after this reorganization, how the CCP is built to fight information warfare. And keep in mind, I'm not saying this is the PLA's information warfare command and control, because the PLA is the party's army. Unlike, say, in the Western democratic setup, where there's a clear delineation between the military and the political establishment, in one party system, there's none. And so this is a highly concentrated command control that we're dealing with. Now, this is the sheer complexity of the information warfare command control of the PLA or the CCP. You don't have to really squint and look at this. The idea is not to look at this. I just want to showcase the 3 tiers to it, the strategic, operational, and the tactical tiers to the information warfare command control, and it's pretty intricate. We look into the first 2 tiers. Let's look at the strategic tier. Now, there are 2 interesting things about, and again, don't have to really pay too much attention to look at what's in there, because I'll explain that. Now, there are 2 interesting things to note about the strategic information warfare command control. The first thing is that the Chinese information warfare command control integrates both the civilian and the military elements. So I've shown the civilian elements in red and the military elements in blue. The second most interesting thing is that the strategic information warfare, especially strategic information warfare, is directly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party through a highly centralized national command authority called the Central Military Commission. The SSF, the Strategic Support Force, most likely has its own operational teams, or operational bureaus as we call them. They used to be called Technical Reconnaissance Bureaus earlier. You've probably heard of them, TRBs. Now they're called Technical Reconnaissance Bases. This scope has increased a little bit. Now, the TRBs have specific missions. These missions could be around capabilities, could be around geographies, or could be around specific technologies. Now, very little is known about the TRBs which are directly under the Strategic Support Force. If you look at the sort of the red circle on the far right, that's where these TRBs likely exist, but we don't know much about them. But the one TRB we do know about from the past is APT-1, Unit 61398, the well-known one, and that certainly probably has gotten absorbed after the reorganization into the Strategic Support Force and probably exists directly under the SSF. So to summarize, there's TRBs or operational bureaus directly under the SSF, and that matters. Let's look at the operational tier now. The operational tier, of course, flows downstream from the strategic tier, but we know a lot more about the operational tier. Most of the Chinese, the PRC APTs exist here that we know of. On the military side, there are operational bureaus or technical reconnaissance bases directly under the theater commands. So they have more geographic-centric missions, like there could be a TRB aligned with Western Theater Command, and so on and so forth. That's shown in blue here. On the civilian side, the state security bureaus, which are the provincial units of the Ministry of State Security, the famous Foreign Intelligence Agency, also has certain provincial teams, which is where most of the APTs exist. So if you look at the left, where the military TRBs are, you have the Tonto team, you have TIC, you have Black Tech, you have Nikon, and you have Red Foxtrot. On the civilian side, you have APT-10, APT-27, APT-31, which is based out of Hubei State Security Bureau, which is supported by the Hubei State Security Bureau. There's APT-40 at Lucia, and APT-41. So we know a lot more about what's happening at this level. The tactical tier also goes downstream further to the operational tier further goes downstream to the tactical tier, where you have cyber information warfare units at the provincial and the county levels, at the city level. But we're not going to go into that. Now, there seems to be a lot of organized chaos, right? So many threat actors, so much overlap. What does this mean? How do we decode this organized chaos? There's a method to do that. We also seen there are multiple threat activity clusters which have an overlap in Volt Typhoon and so many other cyber operations. So how do we really decode that? It really muddies the water of attribution. Military-civil fusion is the answer. It is how the PRC has built a modular, almost like a plug-in-based information warfare command control. And that's how the PLA outnumbers the US Cyber Command by a factor of 10 to 1. Let's look at military-civil fusion, how it is organized. This is the method in the chaos. This is how the CCP integrates the disparate civilian elements into the information warfare command. So at the top of the pyramid, there's the strategic information warfare capability that's headed directly by the Strategic Support Force, authorized by the Central Military Commission. So they are TRBs, as I mentioned earlier, they're TRBs directly under the SSF. Those TRBs are probably meant to do strategic cyber operations, information operations. At the middle tier is where the theater command TRBs and the civilian elements integrate. And especially the Ministry of State Security, the Foreign Intelligence Agency, is also known as, they're part of what they call the authorized forces, Shoshan Lilian, whose cyber forces can be attached to the PLA during wartime. At the tactical level, we have the information warfare reserves, militias, patriotic hackers, and cybersecurity companies which can form part of that. Now, what's going to happen is that during wartime, all these formations are going to get organized into what's called the Information Operations Group. And I believe that that formation has already started happening. Information warfare, information operations group have been set up for wartime readiness. It's quite evident. The CCP also believes that cyber operations lie in the gray zone between war and peace. And so there's quite an ambiguity and fluctuation whether there's a clear war or peace in cyberspace. So they come up with a methodology called military struggle, Jinshi dodging. It's similar to Russia's concept of information confrontation or informacija vojna. It's quite similar to what they call hybrid warfare as well. Now, you've seen the organization, and look at the guiding principles. There are 3 guiding principles behind this organizing the civilian and military elements into a cohesive structure. Small core, big periphery. What that means is that the central national command authority to guide all this and direct all this and authorize all this would always be the Central Military Commission under the CCP. Political control is always there. Civilian during peacetime and military during wartime. That's how the Ministry of State Security and the civilian apparatus these authorized forces, as I mentioned, can be absorbed into the military warfare command control. Last one, CMC leads, theaters fight, and services build. Basically, it means that CMC is always in control, just in case you've forgotten that. Let's take certain examples of military-civil fusion. The CCP has established an upstream supply chain of offensive tool chains, exploit, malware, and even operational infrastructure. Shadowpad is one example. APD-31 is another example, as we've seen, and there are so many other examples where they have set up basically an upstream supply chain of exploitation tool chains which are used by different threat actors, and that's why you see a lot of overlap there. Now, we talked about the structure, organization, hierarchy of the PLA's information warfare. Let's talk about its methods or principles. The military doctrine, if you heard of this term, provides common principles, body of knowledge, and best practices to how to wage warfare. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the military doctrine here looks like. Now, this diagram is purposefully complex. You don't have to go through it, trust me. You can always refer back to it later. I have a high-resolution image available. But what I'm trying to showcase is how diffused and complicated the information warfare command control and its warfighting concepts are. There's so much to it. So I wanted to jot all this down on a chalkboard like a mad professor, which I did. And so there's no clear hierarchy to these concepts, these warfighting concepts. They're highly diffused. Again, you have to read this offline. I'll look into specific aspects of this in my slides. The first most startling thing and really interesting bit about the warfighting concepts or the doctrine of the PLA and the CCP is that they believe that to establish airspace and sea dominance in the near abroad, they'll have to first establish or control the information space globally. This is really startling or interesting, actually. So airspace and sea dominance is totally directly linked to information dominance. The PLA doesn't believe in fighting force on force, military on military, fighter on fighter, tank on tank kind of warfare. They believe in systems of systems warfare. That is, they target the adversaries' politics, economy, foreign affairs, technology, and culture. And that's why information warfare combined with political warfare or cognitive warfare is the key. And that's what is being intended here. I'm moving quite quickly because these are just broad summaries of complex concepts. The PLA also believes in highly integrated, information-driven warfighting, so where all the cyber, electromagnetic, political, cognitive elements are fused into each other. It's called Integrated Network Electronic Warfare, INEW. It was coined by Major General Dai Kingman. And the PLA also has another concept to link information warfare with kinetic warfare. That's physical warfare. It's called the information and firepower warfare. Now, I've talked about so many concepts, right? We look at the foundations, the organization, the hierarchy, and all that. Let's look at how all this works, what will happen, and how. Now, what's happening with Volt Typhoon was clearly laid out in the Chinese military literature. Now, while the CCP believes in peaceful rise, and the PLA is a defensive force, it does believe that cyberspace allows you to be offense dominant. You have to be offensive in cyberspace. the major reason for this is because they believe that deterrence already exists in cyberspace. So you have the first mover advantage there by disrupting the tenet of deterrence there. So the SSF is actually an expeditionary and a first strike force. It is a highly offensive force. It'll strike first before an actual physical warfare starts. And to strike first, they had to carefully select targets to disrupt the political or strategic establishment of the adversary, system of systems, as I called earlier. And that is what is happening here. Even the key strike targets or the vital point targets are clearly defined in the PLA military literature. And that targeting closely aligned with what we saw with Volt Typhoon and Red Echo. If you look at the second point in my slide deck, it lists all the targets which the PLA should compromise before the onset of information warfare. And so they clearly mention strategic early warning systems, and that's why you saw emergency warning systems getting popped, because they will probably use to start disinformation campaigns when conventional war begins. We looked at a lot of the concepts, but why is the PRC doing such risky maneuvers? What is the grand strategy here, the grand goal here? What is at stake here that PLA had to do, or the PRC had to do such risky maneuvering? It's called the Multipolar Asia's Great Game, which Jeff Moss, I believe, also mentioned very briefly. You know, if you look at this map, and you see that big fat pipe over the Strait of Malacca, that's where the world's most dense energy flows are going through to the sea lines of communication. It's the most expensive and the most contested real estate in the world. It's the biggest choke point in the world. If the Malacca Strait gets blockaded, pretty much the whole world trade would collapse. And it's a narrow strait, really, within the Pacific Ocean. The CCP's political leadership knows its vulnerability in that part of the world. They call it the Malacca Dilemma, which was coined by Hu Jintao. And it's desperate to secure its geo-economic interest in the South China Sea, which makes sense. Now, to do that, it needs to create deterrent effects, and it needs to alter the balance of power in that region. But it's not easy. The CCP suffers from what the scholars of international relations call the geopolitical claustrophobia. It's surrounded by great powers. Some of the largest armies in the world and 5 nuclear-armed nations. This is the hotspot, and they have to gain airspace and sea dominance in the region to basically sustain their geo-economic interests. The only option available is to disrupt the existing balance of power in the region by slightly displacing the US from the region, especially in the PRC's near abroad, the South China Sea. This will be quite disruptive because the US offers security guarantees to smaller countries in that region. It has also extended nuclear deterrence in that part of the world. So it's not going to be that easy, and that's why a whole logistical effort is being done to plan for it. Now, we have a theory in international relations, and I'm a technical researcher, malware analyst, but I got too deep into international relations. The theory in international relations is called the balance of power theory. What that means is that to gain power, you have to take it away from someone. It's a zero-sum game. So there's no other way to really strike or change the balance of power. You have to take it from someone else, and that's why you have to be offensive. This is a conventional theory. It's well applied throughout the world over the last many hundred years. Now, to seek stability and peace in the region, the CCP believes it'll have to seek conflict, a very common occurrence in great power competition, really. So I've already touched upon the bottom line earlier. I won't go into this detail. These are key takeaways, which I touched upon earlier. We may have a little bit more time. So before the Q&A starts, I'll quickly jump into a few more things very quickly. I talked about the great game being played in multipolar Asia. Let's look at the first point there. So both the US military and the PLA have their own frameworks for fighting warfare just in the South China Sea. The US calls it the air-sea battle, and the PLA calls it the anti-access area denial A to AD. And the information warfare that we're seeing, the Volt Typhoon kind of targeting that we've seen is very intrinsically part of this larger framework. If you want to understand that, you will understand this. Couple of things, and in 30 seconds I'll wrap up. Now, I mentioned that CCP believes to be offense dominant in cyberspace, but there's a problem. Because if you target Western critical infrastructure, especially the US, they might deem it as highly escalatory and may respond with a kinetic strike. And there's a big blind spot in the CCP's understanding of how escalatory these kind of operations would be if they create a disruptive effect. Lastly, I mentioned Volt Typhoon targeted Africa. Why? Multilateral deterrence. The CCP can authorize the targeting of, say, neutral countries to showcase will and resolve. It's clearly written in the literature. To summarize, all that is happening is going by the book, and I just hope that the outcomes that may happen won't be that catastrophic or disruptive for the world and for the US and for the PRC. That's all to my presentation. These are my sources. I've quoted like 70 sources. Took me 2 years or 1 or 2 years to work this out. And thank you. Any questions, please? You can, please. Yeah. Please do mention your name as well. Very helpful. Yeah.
Right. Thanks for your very insightful presentation. My name is Derek. I'm from Singapore's Digital and Intelligence Service, so somewhat like the SSF counterpart for Singapore. Right. My question is more in a way operational, tactical, with regards to the co-option of civilian outfits. Now, based on your research, what is the CCP's approach towards the cyber underground criminal groups? Do you see co-option, collaboration? First, what is the policy stance with regards to working with criminal underground? And then what is the lived reality with regards to working with the criminal underground? And would that be a source of vulnerability for the SSF where the corruption will make the system collapse, in the longer term? And how does this compare with Russia's approach to the co-option of the criminal underground? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thanks for asking. So I'll give you one example. Yes, there is a criminal nexus, which is, these are called the digital quartermasters, which are supplying all the tooling to the different teams, which are targeting them. Shadowpad is one example, which is supplied by a specific group. It's a malware, which is supplied by a specific group, which is also doing criminal operations, part of the APT41 and VINTI umbrella. And I believe the decision has already been taken. The criminal elements have been co-opted, and yes, it can lead to difficulties in the coordination of the information warfare command control when they have to do strategic operations. And there's even a bit more story to that. There's a little bit of politicization of the command control as well. So the Shadowpad malware had plugins. Some of these plugins were really effective. Some of these plugins were not shared with the PLA. They were only shared with MSS. So there's a bit of pecking order there and a little bit of politics there. And there's a little bit of bargaining with criminals to supply what they can as part of this upstream supply chain. And yes, we don't know how the information operations group would work in reality because there's a little bit of underlying chaos and politics in there. Yeah. Please.
I have a question. So just recently there have been a Vulkan file leak.
Yes.
Yes. So for example, I spent 6 months analyzing the documents, and it was interesting to see how because Russia have been conducting China operations for so many years, and they've realized it's a havoc. They try to take over the same targets again and again because they don't have centralized infrastructure where to store all of the reconnaissance information and so on. Did you encounter any information like that in China? How do they store all of that, tools, information? How do they coordinate operations and so on, in terms of software, management software? Have you encountered information like that?
Excellent question. So there are data fusion platforms which are built by certain contractors like iSeek. There's definitely focus on intelligentization and informationization, which is using AI to start creating more targeting from the stolen data. Started a long time back with Office of Personal Management with the Anthem leak and all this. So there's definitely a massive data set from which targeting is chosen very selectively, and it's getting better and better. Now, so the other part of your inquiry was that, yes, we don't know. We know some parts of the tooling are built by contractors, but in terms of having a very coordinated mechanism to do this, there's probably none. I can say that very confidently. A lot of work is happening at the provincial level with the state security bureaus of the Ministry of State Security. I don't think there's a grand plan to define these the fusion frameworks and define targets. I don't think it has reached to that level.
I mean, it would be interesting to know, are there any cooperations between Russia and China? Because at the end, I think they are against the West.
Sure. So, like, not in the geostrategic or geopolitical terms. Like, I'm largely looking at how the political establishment is coordinating all this. Definitely not at that level. We have seen overlaps between the Russian threat actors and the Chinese threat actors. It's just because they have the same quartermasters, or they're actually buying exploits from the same places. Like Royal Road RTF weaponizer was a tool which was used to weaponize RTF files, which was used by so many threat actors. So there's a little bit of that noise and mudding of the waters, but I wouldn't deem that as bilateral cooperation for military operations. Because I'm largely looking at it in terms of very well-defined military constructs or protocols. So there's no coordination there, especially for information warfare, which I could discover. Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming, and I guess that's all. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them at the hallway as well. Thank you.